Mark Peters, CEO of Butterball Farms, Inc. in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In order to explain why we're so involved in capital development initiatives, I really have to go back to my childhood. And, my father was a pretty transactional business guy. Like, you come to work for X amount of money, you put in eight hours a day, 40 hours a week, and that's the beginning and the end of the relationship. So then I went to work for my dad when I was 12 years old. My dad got his supervisors around, introduced me, and said, if this is my son, and if he does anything wrong, fire him. Don't come ask me, just fire him. And my dad just never bluffed. So I spent my year of 12 years old, 13, 14, 15, subsequent summers, really getting to know the people that worked for my dad, because I figured I was going to screw up, so I'd need some allies in the process. I started to learn about people's lived experience that was very different than mine. I would go home to a great home in the suburbs, never worried about food on the table, never worried about the clothes I was going to wear. My mom was always home, to cook meals. And, I ended up getting to know people who their primary concern is whether their kids were going to be home when they got home from work, whether they could keep them out of trouble, whether they could make their rent payments, whether they'd be able to, have a safe environment for their kids. Part of what I learned about stewardship growing up in conservative religious school, family, was having some responsibility for your fellow man. And what I wasn't seeing was, here was my father running this business, and all these people would show up, and there was no sense of stewardship in that relationship. And I remember talking to one of my sisters. Actually, she reminded me of this conversation years later. She said, we were sitting on the roof of the house, and you said to me, if I ever get the chance to run that business, I'm going to figure out a different way to run it. I got the opportunity to run the business, and I decided I was going to run it differently than my father, and figure out how to create a work environment that people wanted to be a part of. And one of my centering thoughts back then was, if we can have a positive influence on people coming to work for us for 40 hours a week, it's more likely they're going to have a positive influence on their family when they go home. And the reality is, we have more influence than anybody, because people that work 40 plus hours a week spend more time in my house than they do anywhere else in their lives. I ran into a gentleman, Fred Keller, who runs an organization called Cascade Engineering, and they were trying to move people from Burger King to Cascade Engineering. And he had figured out how to contract with the state of Michigan to bring DHS caseworkers into his business to help solve problems for their employees on site. And I'm like, that's brilliant. Fred Keller helped me convene 16 business owners, basically in West Michigan, to present them with this idea of working together to solve some of these problems that Fred had solved at Cascade. And that organization ultimately became The Source, which now has 28 member companies, over 15,000 people covered in West Michigan. And we've returned an ROI to the member companies of about 300% over 20 years. So The Source primarily does, I guess we call it barrier resolution for our employees. One of the things I think you learn is that absenteeism in the workplace is a symptom. We tend to think of it as business owners. A lot of times it's like, oh, somebody's lazy, or they can't get to work, or they can't whatever. But you don't ever peel back that onion and say, why are people not coming to work? And when you do that, you find that there are a myriad of things. It's housing, it's transportation, it's childcare, it's some health care for themselves, for someone in their family. It's food insecurity. The list goes on and on and on, right? So, what do you do about that as an employer? Like, that's not we're not a social work organization. It's not our problem. Figure it out. But those are complex problems to solve for people that don't have a lot of resources. So the source really exists to be that organization that can solve those problems for those individuals so they stay at work. And there's this idea that people that live in poverty have trusted relationships that aren't very knowledgeable. And they have knowledgeable relationships in their lives, which are often an employer, maybe a school teacher, or maybe somebody else. But they don't have a high degree of trust in those relationships. So we really wanted the source to be that trusted and knowledgeable relationship. I love the word impact because a lot of times we think of it in terms of ROI. And when I talk to business people, I like to use the 300% ROI over 20 years. So everyone's like, wow. So for every $1 you pay and you get $3 back. Yep. And so how do you measure that? Well, we measure it based on retention. And that was the number when we started the organization. We said the cost of losing somebody was $3,200. The more organizations used the source, the more their fees were, which sounds counterintuitive until you think about how much that has to drive the performance of the source in solving problems for people. Because the more companies that send people to the source to use them, the higher their fees are going to be. You're banking on the return of investment, which ends up being retention was the easiest one to measure. But I think the greater impact, and the impact that really is probably more fascinating to me personally, is the impact on people's families, but then also even on the community within each of the organizations. So, you get people that would like they wouldn't have to go talk to a supervisor to get referred to the source. It's like you need to go talk to Joyce at the source. She can help with that. So employees would be referring, people to the source. And we got to the point where, like when employees needed to go to work someplace else, or they sort of felt like they topped out, they didn't want to go to work for a company that wasn't a source member company. So it almost became a branding thing for some companies. It's like, well, if you're not a source member company, we're not going to work for you. Besides turnover, which was the big driver for the source metrics, but internally we saw like our safety incidences go down. We saw our defect rates go down. We saw the amount of internal promotions go up. And I think when people start getting stable, they get more interested in their own learning too. So when you would present somebody with like, hey, you should go back and get your associate's degree, or try to finish your GED or whatever, people would be like, I don't know. But as they got more stable, they were more interested, and they would seek out like the opportunities to get a GED, or to get English as a second language, or to go on and get an associate's degree. And so we've seen a lot of that happen within our organizations, and we've seen it now across the source member companies. The source was the fact that companies came around and tried it, and it worked. And then more companies became attracted, and then the source model has been replicated now across the country. For me personally, one of my missions is to help business leaders understand the complexities of the people that come to work for them. But it only goes so far. The next thing I want to do is inspire them to think differently about how we invest in that talent. Because once we get people stabilized, and we understand that we actually have the power as employers to build a framework, not to do this as a one-off kind of thing, but build a framework that's repeatable and sustainable, that can get people to stability. The next challenge is to get them to, how do we get them to thriving? How do we move them from being stable to investing in the next future best job for them? And you're unlocking the human capital that has been untapped in this country for decades. The government has pumped in millions and millions and millions of dollars into job training, job readiness, but they get people into job one and not job two, and not job three, and not job four. And the problem for small to mid-market companies like mine is we don't have these robust career paths for people to pull them through. However, if I get creative and start thinking about other employers in my community that might have steps in that stepping stool, now that gets super interesting. I'm willing to invest in people that are working in these entry-level jobs if I know what they need to learn to get them to your $30 an hour job. And if that means they stay with me 2 years while they learn that, and then they know they have the $30 an hour job, I'm in. Like, let's do that. We can solve this problem. If I look back on the 30 years since my dad passed, what I'm the most proud of, and if you would sit down and have a coffee with me and not know me, you would hear the stories. You would hear the stories of the people who have come through the doors and whose lives have been changed because they worked for our company, because they walked into the doors of an employer who believed there was some better future. And honestly, it's why I get out of bed in the morning. If you said to me, you're not allowed to do that with your company anymore, I would walk out the next day and I'd find a buyer for my company. I think I have two pieces of advice. One is take the time to get to know the backstory of the people that work for you at every level. Take some time to understand what the complexities that they face every day are. And then think about how your enterprise can impact those. The other piece of advice that I would have is a lot of us are taught that business is business. It's all about the numbers, and you've got to hit, this level of EBITDA or this level of profitability and all the rest of it. I would love to say, look inside and find what inspires you, because I'm 60 right now as we're making this video, and I have a lot of peers who are starting to say things like, I'm going to sell my business and go do something more purposeful. And I think to myself, why? You've got a whole enterprise that has people that bring all sorts of things into your workplace. Why wouldn't you engage the enterprise and make the enterprise more purposeful?